Look at a photo of people from different parts of the world, and most of us make an unconscious assumption that these differences in skin tone are ancient, deep, and essentially permanent features of separate human populations. We tend to think of light skin as European, dark skin as African, and everything in between as neatly sorted into the geography it came from, as if these traits have always looked exactly the way they look today. But that assumption is wrong, and the degree to which it's wrong is genuinely astonishing. For the vast majority of our species' existence, stretching back roughly 300,000 years, all modern humans were dark-skinned. Not most humans, not humans in certain regions. All of them. The common ancestor you share with every person alive today had deeply pigmented skin, and that was the norm for an almost incomprehensibly long stretch of time. The variation we see across the globe today, particularly the lighter skin tones found across much of Europe and parts of East Asia, is not ancient. It's startlingly recent. Here's what makes this even more interesting. Skin colour isn't a badge of identity or a marker of fundamentally different kinds of people. It's an adaptation, a biological response to a specific environmental pressure, the same way sweat glands respond to heat or altitude changes red blood cell counts. The melanin in your skin is essentially a tool, one that evolution tuned over generations depending on how much ultraviolet radiation a population was regularly exposed to. Dark skin evolved in Africa under an intense equatorial sun because it offered protection. What happened later, in other places, was a response to a very different set of conditions. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange, because the timeline doesn't line up the way most people expect. Humans left Africa tens of thousands of years ago. They spread across Asia, into Europe, across land bridges into the Americas. You might expect that as populations moved into lower UV environments, cloudy northern latitudes with weak winter sunlight, lighter skin would have evolved quickly and continuously. But the ancient DNA evidence tells a more complicated story. For thousands of years after humans settled in Europe, many of them were still carrying the genetic variants associated with darker skin. The dramatic shift toward lighter pigmentation in parts of Eurasia didn't happen gradually across all those millennia. Much of it happened in a concentrated window of time, roughly 8,000 years ago, and it appears to have spread with unusual speed. So what changed? What was happening around 8,000 years ago that would cause specific genetic mutations to sweep through populations so rapidly and so completely? Why then, after tens of thousands of years of relative stability, did this particular trait shift so dramatically in such a short window of time? That's the question this video is going to answer, and the answer involves ancient migrations, a revolution in how people ate, and a surprisingly powerful evolutionary pressure that most people never think about when they think about skin colour. The story of why you look the way you do turns out to be far younger, far stranger, and far more dynamic than almost anyone imagines. To understand why that change around 8,000 years ago was so significant, you first have to understand what dark skin was actually doing, why it existed in the first place, and why it was so stable for so long. Our species, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa, and Africa, particularly the equatorial and sub-Saharan regions where early modern humans lived and developed, is one of the most UV-intense environments on the planet. The sun sits high in the sky year-round. The days are long. The atmosphere provides relatively little buffer against ultraviolet radiation compared to higher latitudes. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors were living and working and foraging outdoors in conditions of relentless, powerful solar exposure. Under those conditions, the biology of skin pigmentation wasn't a cosmetic detail. It was a matter of survival and reproduction. Here's how it works. Skin gets its colour primarily from a pigment called melanin, which is produced by specialised cells called melanocytes. The more melanin your skin contains, and the more it's distributed toward the surface, the darker your complexion appears. What melanin actually does is absorb and scatter incoming ultraviolet radiation before it can penetrate deeply into skin tissue. It functions, in the most direct sense, as a biological sunscreen, one built directly into the body. In low melanin skin, ultraviolet radiation passes more freely into the deeper layers of skin. One of the things it does there is break down folate, a B vitamin that circulates in the blood and is critically important for DNA synthesis and cell division. Folate depletion becomes particularly dangerous in pregnant women because folate is essential for the proper development of the neural tube in a growing fetus. Insufficient folate during early pregnancy is one of the primary causes of neural tube defects, serious conditions that can result in miscarriage, stillbirth, or severe disability. That's why folate matters so much, and why UV-driven folate degradation was a real evolutionary pressure, not a minor inconvenience. Dark skin, by blocking a significant portion of that ultraviolet radiation, helped preserve folate levels. Populations living under intense UV exposure with higher melanin concentrations had better protection against this degradation, meaning better reproductive outcomes, healthier pregnancies, and higher rates of fetal survival. Over many generations in a high UV environment, this translates directly into differential reproductive success, which is exactly how natural selection works. Melanin also reduced the risk of direct DNA damage in skin cells. Ultraviolet radiation, particularly the UVB wavelengths, can cause mutations in DNA, and accumulated mutations in skin cells are a primary driver of skin cancer. While skin cancer typically develops later in life, after the peak reproductive years, severe sunburn and chronic UV damage to skin can impair the body's ability to regulate temperature and maintain its barrier function, creating real short-term costs. The protection melanin offered was relevant across multiple biological systems simultaneously, so dark pigmentation in humans wasn't a regional trait that developed in Africa and then became irrelevant elsewhere. It was the ancestral condition, the starting point for the entire species. When you trace the genetics of pigmentation back through the lineage of Homo sapiens, the original state is high melanin. Everything else is a departure from that baseline driven by changes in environment. And for an enormously long stretch of time, somewhere around 100,000 years, possibly longer depending on how you define the population, that baseline held. Early modern humans remained within or near the environments where dark skin was strongly favoured. Even as populations shifted and spread within Africa, the UV conditions across most of the continent continued to select for high pigmentation. There was no pressure pulling in the other direction, so the trait remained stable. Evolution doesn't change things for the sake of variety. It changes things when something in the environment starts rewarding a different version. That stability is worth sitting with for a moment, because it sets up the real strangeness of what came later. For the overwhelming majority of our species' existence, the story of human skin colour was essentially one chapter long. Dark skin worked, it was maintained, it persisted across an almost unimaginable span of time. Then people started moving into places where the rules were completely different. So what exactly changes when people move into a different UV environment? To answer that, you need to understand that skin pigmentation isn't simply about blocking sun damage. It's a balancing act. And the thing being balanced is just as important as what's being blocked. Here's the other side of the equation. Ultraviolet radiation, specifically UVB wavelengths, does something useful when it hits your skin. It triggers the production of vitamin D, a compound that's technically a hormone, and that your body cannot get in sufficient quantities from food alone, at least not under the conditions our ancestors were living in. Vitamin D is essential for calcium absorption, which means it's critical for bone density and skeletal development. It plays roles in immune function, muscle performance, and cardiovascular health. A severe deficiency doesn't kill you immediately, but it creates compounding disadvantages that accumulate over a lifetime and can ripple into reproductive outcomes. Now consider what happens when a population with high melanin content moves to a low UV environment, say a latitude far from the equator, where the sun sits lower in the sky for much of the year. Winter days are short, clouds are frequent, and the overall intensity of solar radiation is a fraction of what it is in equatorial Africa. In that environment, the UV blocking properties of dark skin, which was such a profound advantage near the equator, start working against the organism. Melanin is blocking the radiation that would otherwise be synthesizing vitamin D. Suddenly, the same biological feature that protected folate and prevented DNA damage is also preventing the body from producing a nutrient it critically needs. The biological sunscreen has become too effective for the new conditions. This is the core tension that drives the evolution of skin pigmentation across different environments. Dark skin is strongly favored where UV is intense, lighter skin is favored where UV is weak, and vitamin D synthesis becomes the limiting problem. The selective pressure runs in opposite directions depending on where you are, and over enough generations, populations respond to whichever pressure is stronger. What makes this more complex and more interesting is that skin color is not controlled by a single gene with a simple on-off switch. It's a polygenic trait, meaning it's shaped by variations across many different genes, probably somewhere in the range of a dozen or more that have significant effects, along with potentially hundreds of others with smaller contributions. These genes influence how many melanocytes you have, how efficiently they produce melanin, what type of melanin they produce, and how that melanin is packaged and distributed throughout the skin. The visible spectrum of human skin color, from the deepest brown to the palest beige, represents a vast combinatorial landscape of genetic variation, not a simple dial with a few settings. This is also why tanning, the temporary darkening of skin in response to UV exposure, is different from your inherited baseline pigmentation. Tanning is a short-term physiological response. When UV radiation hits the skin, it triggers existing melanocytes to ramp up melanin production and distribute it more broadly, providing a temporary increase in protection. But this response operates within limits defined by your genetics. Someone with a baseline of low pigmentation can tan, but they can only go so far. The architectural constraints encoded in their genome set the ceiling. Inherited pigmentation is the structure of the building. Tanning is what happens when you open the windows. When we talk about populations evolving lighter or darker skin over thousands of years, we're talking about changes in the underlying architecture, actual shifts in the frequency of genetic variants across a population, driven by differential reproductive success, not seasonal adjustments, but multi-generational transformation in the gene pool itself, and that transformation can happen faster than you might expect. Skin color sits in a special category of traits, where the selective pressure can be quite intense, because the consequences of getting it wrong in a given environment affect survival and reproduction directly. Folate depletion from excessive UV damages pregnancies. Vitamin D deficiency weakens bones, compromises immune systems, increases mortality. These aren't subtle fitness differences operating at the margins. Under strong enough selection, traits can shift meaningfully within a few hundred generations, which, in human terms, sounds like a long time but is a geological instant. This is a crucial point for everything that follows, because one assumption people sometimes bring to questions about human skin color is that it must have taken an enormous, almost inconceivable span of time to change, that it's such a fundamental feature of appearance that it must be deeply ancient and fixed. The science doesn't support that. Given sufficiently strong selection in a new UV environment, pigmentation can evolve on timescales that are relatively short by evolutionary standards. Thousands of years. tens of thousands of years at the outside, not hundreds of thousands. Which brings us back to the question of timing. If human populations began moving out of Africa into lower UV environments more than 60,000 years ago, and if lighter pigmentation is genuinely adaptive in those environments, why does the genetic evidence suggest that light skin in Europe became widespread only around 8,000 years ago? Why didn't it evolve earlier, during all those millennia when people were already living at northern latitudes? That's the puzzle. And to start unravelling it, you need to follow the actual movement of human populations out of Africa and pay close attention to what the evidence tells us about what they looked like when they got there. The question was sitting right there at the end of the last thought. If people left Africa tens of thousands of years ago and moved into environments with dramatically less ultraviolet radiation, why didn't light skin follow immediately? To answer that properly, you have to actually trace where people went, how they lived when they got there, and what the biology of selection requires before it can produce visible change at the population level. The first major expansion of modern humans out of Africa began somewhere around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. This wasn't a single dramatic event, a caravan crossing a border and entering a new continent. It was a slow generational drift, small groups moving incrementally into the Middle East, then fanning out from there across southern Asia, eventually reaching Southeast Asia and Australia. A later pulse of movement pushed populations into Central Asia and then west into Europe, and north and east into the interior of the Eurasian landmass. These were not rapid conquests of territory. They were the gradual expansion of populations following resources, responding to climate shifts, fragmenting and reconnecting across millennia. By around 45,000 years ago, modern humans had a significant presence in Europe. By 40,000 years ago, they were distributed across a wide arc from the Atlantic coast to Siberia. Now, the people doing this travelling, the ones crossing into the Middle East, threading through Central Asia, pushing up into the latitudes of present-day Ukraine or France, were almost certainly dark-skinned. Not because that's an assumption, but because the genetic architecture of dark pigmentation was the ancestral state shared by all modern human populations, and there's no evidence that major depigmentation variants had yet appeared or spread at this point. These founding populations carried the pigmentation of their African ancestors into entirely new UV landscapes, and here is the critical thing that often gets glossed over. Moving north didn't flip a genetic switch. Lighter skin isn't a spontaneous response to a new environment. It requires mutations to arise, or existing variants to be under strong enough selection that they spread through a population across many generations of differential reproductive success. The people who first walked into Ice Age Europe were dark-skinned, and they stayed that way for a very long time. Not because selection wasn't present, it was, but because selection takes time to restructure a population's gene pool, and because other factors were actively reducing the pressure to change. This is where behaviour enters the picture in a way that fundamentally complicates the simple story of moving north equals getting pale. Early humans arriving in high-latitude environments were not naked and exposed to whatever UV the sky offered. They were wearing animal skins. They were sheltering in caves, building structures, using fire. They were living through long winters in ways that minimized exposure to the elements. And crucially, they were eating diets that included substantial quantities of animal fat, organ meat, and fish, all sources of preformed vitamin D that don't require sunlight to access. Consider what this means for the selective pressure. The entire evolutionary argument for lighter skin in northern latitudes rests on the vitamin D problem, that dark skin blocks too much UV for the body to synthesize adequate amounts. But if a population is getting significant dietary vitamin D from fatty fish, marine mammals, or organ-rich land animals, that pressure is blunted. The biological urgency of lighter skin is reduced. The fitness disadvantage of staying dark is smaller when you can compensate through what you eat. And if you're spending most of the winter bundled in furs inside a shelter, the UV arriving at your skin is minimal, regardless of your pigmentation. The sunscreen effect of dark melanin matters much less when the sun itself is rarely reaching you. This is why the gap between migration and depigmentation exists. Migration happened on one timescale. Selection for lighter skin operated on a different one, and it was contingent on conditions, dietary, behavioral, climatic, that weren't immediately pushing populations toward rapid pigmentation change. The founding populations that moved out of Africa could remain dark-skinned for many thousands of years, across many hundreds of generations, without that pigmentation becoming a severe enough liability to drive rapid genetic transformation. What the ancient DNA evidence will eventually show, and we'll get to that evidence in detail shortly, is that populations were living in Europe at high latitudes with dark or intermediate pigmentation for an astonishingly long time. Not for a few generations while they adjusted, for tens of thousands of years. The Paleolithic hunters who made the painted caves of France and Spain, who ranged across the mammoth steppes of Eastern Europe and Siberia, who established themselves as the dominant human presence across the continent. The genetics suggest they were significantly darker than the Europeans of today. Not African dark necessarily, but certainly not the pale complexions that now predominate at those latitudes. This is the gap that needs explaining. It's a gap of perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 years between the time humans established themselves in Europe and the time that the specific genetic variant strongly associated with light skin in modern Europeans actually swept through the population. Migration does not explain the timing. The people migrated. The genes didn't immediately follow. Something happened much later, something that triggered a relatively rapid spread of depigmentation variants across the European population, and it happened in a window centered around 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. That's not a migration story. That's something else. And the reason we know this with such precision, the reason we can actually say what those ancient populations looked like with reasonable confidence, rather than just guessing, is because of a technological revolution in genetics that nobody could have predicted even a few decades ago. Scientists learned how to read DNA from the dead, from bones that had been in the ground for thousands of years, and what they found completely overturned what most researchers had assumed about when Europeans became European in any meaningful visual sense. For most of human history, the only way to guess what ancient people looked like was to look at their descendants. Researchers would study the populations living in a region today, map out the physical traits, the skin tones, the eye colours, and assume that the deeper past probably looked something like a more ancestral version of the present. It was a reasonable enough approach given the tools available, but it was fundamentally a backward projection, taking modern humans and running the film in reverse, assuming continuity where there may have been radical change. Ancient DNA shattered that assumption completely. The technology itself is genuinely remarkable. When an organism dies, its DNA begins to degrade. Exposure to water, oxygen, bacteria, heat, all of it chews through the genetic material over time. For most of the 20th century, scientists assumed that DNA more than a few thousand years old would be too fragmented and contaminated to be useful. Then techniques improved. Researchers learned to work with tiny damaged fragments. They learned to distinguish ancient human DNA from the microbial DNA that had invaded the sample over centuries. They figured out how to sequence the genome of someone who'd been dead for 10, 20, 30, even 40,000 years, and once they could do that, they could look directly at the genes, including the genes controlling pigmentation. The pigmentation variants scientists look for are specific. They're not guesses or proxies. Researchers know from decades of work on living populations exactly which genetic positions strongly predict lighter or darker skin. The SLC24F5 gene carries a variant that is present in the vast majority of light-skinned Europeans today and nearly absent in dark-skinned African populations. The SLC45A2 gene tells a similar story. There are others, HERC2 and OCA2. Influence eye color, MC1R, plays a role in both hair and skin tone. When you sequence an ancient genome and check those positions, you can make confident inferences about what a person likely looked like. Not with photographic certainty, but with the same kind of probabilistic confidence we use in forensic genetics today. When scientists applied these tools to the remains of early European hunter-gatherers, the results were genuinely startling. The ancient people who'd been living in Western Europe, the ones whose bones and teeth and sometimes preserved tissue had been sitting in archaeological sites across Spain, Luxembourg and elsewhere, were missing the key light skin variants that are nearly universal in modern Europeans. They carried the ancestral darker pigmentation variants. At the same time, many of them carried variants associated with lighter or even blue eyes. It was a combination that feels counterintuitive to a modern observer, because we rarely see it today. Dark skin and pale eyes together. But genetically it makes perfect sense because the genes controlling eye color and skin color are largely independent. Evolution can act on them separately, and apparently it did. The most vivid example is a specimen known as the Mesolithic hunter from the site of La Braña in northern Spain, dating to around 7,000 years ago. When researchers reconstructed his likely appearance from his genome, they found strong evidence for dark skin and blue eyes. He was not an outlier. Similar findings came from hunter-gatherer remains in Luxembourg, Sweden, and other parts of Western Europe. These were not edge cases or statistical noise. They were a consistent pattern pointing to the same conclusion. The people who hunted and gathered across Ice Age and post-Ice Age Europe, who knew that landscape intimately, who left behind art and tools and elaborate burials, they did not look like the Europeans of today. This directly overturned the intuitive picture that had dominated thinking for generations. Before ancient DNA, if you asked most people, scientists included, to imagine a prehistoric European, they would likely picture someone resembling a modern Northern or Western European, perhaps rougher, perhaps more weathered, but essentially recognizable. The assumption of continuity ran deep. It felt logical. Europe had people in it for tens of thousands of years. Those people are the ancestors of modern Europeans. So surely those ancient people looked broadly similar to their descendants. But that assumption was wrong. Or at least it was dramatically incomplete. The genetic data tells us that prehistoric Europe was not a faded or older version of modern Europe. It was a visually distinct population occupying the same geography. The skin tones, the pigmentation patterns, the overall appearance, these were different in ways that would be immediately obvious if you could somehow stand those ancient people next to their distant modern counterparts. The continent's current appearance is not simply the ancient appearance preserved by time. It is the result of changes that happened, and happened relatively recently in evolutionary terms, to transform what European populations looked like. What's important to sit with here is what this means for how we think about the relationship between place and appearance. We tend to assume that the people of a region, over long enough time, come to look the way the region's current inhabitants look. That latitude and environment sculpt populations into their present form gradually and continuously. But the ancient DNA evidence breaks that story open. The sculpting was not gradual and continuous. It was irregular. There were long stretches of stability, then periods of dramatic change. And the dramatic change in European pigmentation didn't happen when people first arrived. It happened much later, under specific pressures that we're only now beginning to understand fully. The hunters of ancient Europe lived, and hunted and died with their dark skin intact across thousands of generations. The continent looked different then. The same forests, the same rivers, the same coastlines, but the people moving through them carried a pigmentation history that stretched all the way back to Africa, unbroken, stubbornly persistent, waiting for the conditions that would finally begin to change it. What we've just established about ancient European hunter-gatherers is striking enough on its own. Dark skin, pale eyes, a combination that feels foreign to modern intuition. But once you zoom out and look at the full picture across prehistoric populations and across time, the strangeness deepens considerably. Because it wasn't just that ancient Europeans looked different from modern Europeans. It's that ancient populations across the world routinely carried combinations of visible traits that don't map neatly onto anything we recognize today. The past was not a cleaner, simpler version of the present. It was genuinely different, visually, genetically, in ways we are only beginning to fully appreciate. The fundamental reason for this is that the genes controlling different visible traits operate largely independently of one another. Skin color, hair texture, eye color, hair color. These are influenced by different genetic variants, located in different parts of the genome, shaped by different evolutionary pressures. There is no biological law that says light skin must travel with light eyes, or that dark hair must pair with dark skin. Those correlations exist today in some populations because of the specific history of those populations, because of the migrations, the mixing events, and the selection pressures that happen to produce those combinations. But in prehistoric populations that had different histories, different combinations emerged, and they were just as genetically coherent. They were not anomalies. They were simply the product of a different past. Consider what this means in practice. You could have a population with dark skin but a high frequency of the gene variant associated with lighter, blue or green eyes. You could have a population with relatively lighter skin but very dark, tightly curled hair. You could have populations where individuals varied dramatically from one another in ways that don't cluster into the tidy groupings modern observers might expect. And increasingly, the ancient DNA record shows us exactly these kinds of patterns, not as curiosities, but as the normal state of affairs across much of prehistory. The ancient world was a mosaic of traits, assembled and reassembled by migration, by gene flow, by local selection acting on individual characteristics rather than on whole packages of appearance. What drove this variety was a combination of two forces operating simultaneously, but not always in the same direction. Local natural selection could act on a single gene, pushing, say, a particular skin pigmentation variant higher in frequency in one region, without dragging along every other trait in the genome. Populations might be under strong selection for one characteristic while remaining largely unchanged in others. At the same time, gene flow, the movement of people and their DNA between populations, was constantly mixing things together, introducing new variants, diluting old ones, creating novel combinations that hadn't existed before. The result was not a world organized into distinct, internally consistent types. It was a world of gradients, overlaps, and surprises. This is where the ancient DNA evidence demands something of us that feels genuinely uncomfortable. We have to resist the urge to project modern categories backward. When we look at ancient populations, we instinctively try to place them. We search for recognizable groupings, familiar clusters, some version of the racial or ethnic categories we use to organize the human world today. But those categories are modern constructions, built from a specific historical moment, shaped by recent migrations, by recent selections, by centuries of political and social history. They do not reach back cleanly into the deep past. When you impose them there, you don't illuminate the past, you distort it. ancient peoples did not experience themselves as belonging to the racial categories we would assign them today. A Mesolithic hunter in Spain did not think of himself in terms that would translate meaningfully into any modern ethnic or racial identity. His visible characteristics, his dark skin, his pale eyes, his specific ancestry, were the product of his particular history up to that moment. They had no relationship to the categories that would be constructed tens of thousands of years later by people who couldn't have imagined him, let alone classified him. When we look at his genome and try to ask which modern group he belongs to, we're asking a question he would have found incomprehensible, and more importantly, we're asking a question that the science itself warns us is the wrong one. There's a specific risk here that researchers have been careful to flag. Visible traits change faster than deeper ancestry. This is a crucial asymmetry. The genes for skin pigmentation, eye color, and hair type respond to selection relatively quickly. They can shift significantly in a population across just a few thousand years, which is an eye blink in evolutionary time. But the deeper genetic ancestry, the larger patterns of relatedness, the shared stretches of DNA inherited from common ancestors, changes much more slowly. A population can look dramatically different from its ancestors in terms of visible traits, while remaining closely related to them in terms of overall genomic ancestry. Appearance is, in a real sense, the surface layer. It updates faster. It responds to local conditions more rapidly than the rest of the genome does. This means that if you use visible traits as a shortcut for ancestry, if you assume that people who look similar must share deep genetic history, or that people who look different must be distantly related, you will consistently be wrong. Ancient populations that shared substantial ancestry might have looked quite different from one another, because they had been under different local selection pressures for a few key pigmentation genes. Populations that looked superficially similar might have had very different ancestry, because they had converged independently on similar appearances through separate evolutionary paths. This surface does not reliably predict the depth. What the ancient DNA record offers, then, is not just new information about what prehistoric people looked like. It offers a fundamental correction to how we think about human variation. The neat packages we've become accustomed to, the expectation that certain traits cluster together, that appearance tracks ancestry in predictable ways, that the populations of a region have always looked something like they look today. Those expectations are products of recent history, not deep biological truths. Strip them away, and what you find underneath is a past that was far more visually complex, far more varied, and far less organized around the categories we carry into it. The ancient world did not know it was supposed to sort itself into recognizable types. It simply kept mixing and changing and producing combinations that no modern observer would have predicted, until the forces that reshaped the surface finally caught up and created the world we think of as normal. So we've established that the ancient world was a mosaic, that visible traits shifted, mixed, and recombined in ways that defy modern expectations. But understanding why the surface changed as dramatically as it did in certain regions requires looking at something more than migration or random drift. It requires looking at a revolution in how humans actually lived. Because around 10,000 years ago, something began to happen in the ancient world that would ultimately reshape not just civilizations but bodies. People started farming. The Neolithic transition, the shift from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture, is one of the most consequential developments in human history. Most of us learn about it in terms of its social and technological consequences. Cities, writing, organized religion, standing armies. All of these trace back in some way to the moment when humans began cultivating crops and keeping livestock instead of following the food across the landscape. But what gets talked about far less is the biological dimension of that transition. Farming didn't just change how people organized their societies, It changed the selection pressures acting on their bodies, and it did so in ways that would ripple through the human genome for thousands of years. To understand why, you have to think about what people actually ate before farming and what they ate after. Hunter-gatherer diets were, by necessity, extraordinarily varied. They included whatever the local environment provided: fish, game, shellfish, roots, berries, nuts, leafy plants, insects in some cases. That variety mattered biologically. Wild game and especially fatty fish are rich sources of vitamin D, one of the key nutrients that skin pigmentation directly affects. When hunter-gatherers in high-latitude environments were pulling salmon from rivers, hunting large mammals across open tundra, or eating marine mammals along coastlines, they were taking in dietary vitamin D at rates that could partially compensate for the weaker, more oblique sunlight of northern latitudes. Their bodies were working with two systems at once, synthesizing some vitamin D through skin exposure to sunlight and supplementing it through what they ate. Farming disrupted that balance in a specific and significant way. Early agricultural diets were dominated by cultivated grains: wheat, barley, millet, later rye. These crops are calorically dense and storable, which is precisely why they became the foundation of agricultural economies. But they are nutritionally narrow in ways that wild diets are not. Grain-based diets are low in vitamin D. The fish, the game, the marine resources that had helped sustain hunter-gatherers through northern winters were replaced or heavily reduced as farming communities became more dependent on their fields. You were eating more in the sense of reliable caloric access, but you were eating a diet that was substantially poorer in the specific nutrient that skin color most directly regulates. This mattered more as you moved north. At the latitudes of northern and central Europe, sunlight is already a compromised source of vitamin D. In winter months, the sun sits too low in the sky for its ultraviolet radiation to efficiently trigger vitamin D synthesis in the skin, regardless of how much time you spend outdoors. Even in summer, cloud cover, shorter days, and the angle of sunlight limit what the body can produce. Dark skin, which filters out ultraviolet radiation efficiently, is a significant asset near the equator, where UV exposure is intense and the risk of photo damage and folate depletion is real. But at high latitudes, that same protective filtering becomes a liability. You need more UV, not less. Lighter skin, which allows ultraviolet radiation to penetrate more readily, becomes increasingly advantageous the further from the equator you go, and the less dietary vitamin D you can obtain from your food. Here's what made farming so significant as a selective pressure. It didn't just shift the diet, it shifted the stakes. For a mobile hunter-gatherer community with access to diverse food sources, vitamin D deficiency was a manageable risk. If one source fell short, another might compensate. But for settled agricultural communities increasingly locked into grain-based diets, especially in low sunlight environments, the nutritional shortfall became chronic and unavoidable. The consequences of severe vitamin D deficiency are serious. Weakened bones, impaired immune function, complications in pregnancy and childhood development. In a subsistence farming economy with no access to supplementation, no refrigerated imports, and no dietary flexibility, these consequences fell disproportionately on people whose skin pigmentation reduced their already limited ability to synthesize the vitamin from available sunlight. And settled life compounded the pressure in another way. Farming communities were denser than hunter-gatherer bands. Population concentrations increased. The shift to stored grain created more predictable food supplies, which supported population growth, which meant more people were subject to the same selective pressures simultaneously. In a small dispersed hunter-gatherer group, a genetic variant conferring a modest advantage might take an extremely long time to spread, simply because there aren't many people to spread through. In a dense, sedentary farming population with high birth rates and generation after generation tied to the same land and the same diet, a beneficial variant can move through the gene pool considerably faster. The structure of farming life accelerated selection. This is the connection that explains why the timing matters so much. The lightening of skin pigmentation in European populations didn't happen gradually across hundreds of thousands of years as people slowly moved northward. It happened in a compressed window, concentrated around the period when agriculture took hold. The Neolithic transition was not just a change in subsistence strategy, it was a trigger, a shift in the ecological and nutritional environment that suddenly made lighter skin substantially more advantageous in certain latitudes than it had ever been before. The diet changed. The dependency on that diet deepened. The selection pressure intensified, and the genes responded. What had been a slow drift became something closer to a push, the body adapting generation by generation to a world that farming had fundamentally and permanently remade. So the question becomes, which genes exactly were responding to that pressure? Because natural selection isn't an abstract force. It works through specific variants in specific places in the genome, variants that either help or hurt survival and reproduction in a given environment. When we talk about the genetic shift in skin pigmentation that occurred in Europe over the last 8,000 years, we're talking about real, identifiable changes in real, identifiable genes, and two of them stand out above the rest. The first is SLC24A5. This gene encodes a protein involved in the movement of calcium ions in melanocytes, the cells responsible for producing melanin, the pigment that gives skin, hair, and eyes their colour. There's a particular variant of this gene, a single change at one position in the DNA, that significantly reduces melanin production. Populations carrying this variant tend toward lighter skin, and what the ancient DNA record shows is striking. This variant was essentially absent from Europe for most of human prehistory. The hunter-gatherers who lived across Europe for tens of thousands of years predominantly carried the ancestral version associated with darker pigmentation. Then, over the course of just a few thousand years, the lighter skin variant swept through the European population to the point where it is now found in the overwhelming majority of people with European ancestry. That is an extraordinarily rapid change by any measure of evolutionary time. The second major gene is SLC45A2, which plays a related role in melanin synthesis. Its story is similar. The variant associated with lighter skin was rare or entirely absent in the ancient populations that preceded the Neolithic transition in Europe. It became common and then dominant during roughly the same compressed window. These two genes alone account for a substantial portion of the pigmentation difference between contemporary Europeans and populations in sub-Saharan Africa. And both of them show the unmistakable signature of positive selection. They didn't drift upward slowly over vast timescales, the way neutral genetic changes do. They rose fast, which means something was pushing them. It's worth being precise about what natural selection actually does here, because there's a common misconception worth clearing up. Selection doesn't create new variants on demand. It doesn't reach into the genome and engineer a solution to a problem. What it does is work with what's already there, or with what migration brings in. A variant that confers some advantage has slightly better odds of being passed to the next generation than a variant that doesn't. Repeat that process across hundreds of generations in an environment that consistently rewards the same trait, and a rare variant can become a common one. The light skin alleles in SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 didn't appear out of nowhere 8,000 years ago. They were already present in some individuals, likely at low frequencies, or they were introduced through contact and interbreeding with incoming populations, most plausibly the Anatolian farmers who carried these variants at higher frequencies when they began migrating into Europe. Once those variants were present in a population experiencing strong selection pressure, low sunlight, grain-dependent diets, chronic risk of vitamin D deficiency, they had the conditions they needed to spread, and spread they did at a pace that geneticists describe as rapid, even by the standards of recent human evolution. Studies comparing ancient genomes from different time periods have allowed researchers to essentially watch this happen in slow motion across the archaeological record. Europeans from before the Neolithic transition largely lack these variants. Europeans from the height of the Neolithic period show them beginning to appear and increase. By the Bronze Age and afterward, they are common. The trajectory is clear, the timing is consistent, and the pattern is exactly what you would expect if a combination of selection pressure and population replacement was driving the change. What makes this finding so significant is not just the biology, it's the implied timeline. The genetic shift that produced the light skin most commonly associated with European populations today is, in evolutionary terms, extremely recent. We're not talking about a change that happened gradually over the full span of time that humans have existed. We're not talking about something that slowly accumulated across 100,000 years of northward migration. We're talking about a change that was largely complete within the last few thousand years, driven by identifiable selective forces operating in a specific historical context. The genes are real, the timeline is measurable, and the mechanism, a combination of natural selection acting on existing variation and on variants introduced through migration, is well understood. This matters because it replaces vague intuition with actual data. For a long time, assumptions about skin color were built on the idea that these differences must be ancient, fundamental, deeply rooted in some primordial divergence between human populations. What the genomic evidence shows is something far more dynamic and far more recent. The specific combination of pigmentation variants common in European populations today was assembled within what is, from the perspective of our species' history, basically the last moment. The pressure was real, the genes responded to it, and the result, light skin as a dominant trait in northern and central Europe, is not an ancient inheritance but a recent adaptation, forged by the intersection of a new way of eating, a particular kind of sunlight, and the slow, relentless logic of selection acting on DNA. 2 genes, 1 key transition, and a window of roughly 8,000 years. That's how a species that spent 100 millennia almost entirely dark-skinned began to look in some places dramatically different, not because something mysterious happened, but because the environment changed, the diet changed, and the genome, as it always does, followed. We've been talking about genes and selection pressures as though Europe were a sealed container, a single population sitting in one place, slowly accumulating useful variants over time. But that picture is almost entirely wrong. The real story of how Europe came to look the way it does today is not primarily a story of a single ancestral group gradually adapting to northern latitudes. It's a story of repeated waves of people arriving from different places, carrying different genomes, and mixing with whoever was already there. The skin colour of modern Europeans didn't evolve in isolation. It was assembled from pieces, carried in by migrants, reshuffled by contact, and only then shaped further by selection. To understand this, you have to know that Europe was populated not once but many times over the last 50,000 years, and each major wave brought different ancestral DNA, including different pigmentation alleles, into the mix. The first major inhabitants of post-glacial Europe were the hunter-gatherers. These were the people who had been living across the continent for tens of thousands of years before agriculture arrived, surviving by hunting animals, fishing rivers, and foraging wild plants across forests and grasslands that looked very different from modern Europe. Genetically, these individuals, reconstructed now from dozens of ancient genomes, were a distinct population with their own particular combination of traits, and as we've already established, many of them carried pigmentation profiles that would surprise people who assume light skin has always been the European norm. The genetics suggest darker skin, yet often blue or light-coloured eyes, a combination that seems strange to us now, but was apparently common and stable for a very long time across the continent's early inhabitants. Then, roughly 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, a new group began moving into Europe from the southeast. These were the Anatolian farmers, people from what is now Turkey and the surrounding region, who had developed agricultural practices in the Fertile Crescent and were now expanding outward, carrying their crops, their animals and their genes with them. Their expansion into Europe was not a sudden invasion. It was a gradual, generational process of movement and settlement, and as they spread, they mixed, sometimes extensively, sometimes less so, with the hunter-gatherers they encountered. The Anatolian farmers were genetically distinct from the European hunter-gatherers they were meeting, and critically, they carried different pigmentation variants. Specifically, these incoming farming populations appear to have carried the light skin alleles in SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 at notably higher frequencies than the indigenous hunter-gatherers. This means that a significant portion of the pigmentation shift in European prehistory was not simply selection acting slowly on existing variation within a resident population. It was migration physically carrying lighter pigmentation alleles into Europe in the bodies of people who were moving, settling, farming and having children alongside and with the people already living there. Population movement was the delivery mechanism. Selection then determined which variants persisted and spread. This is a fundamental reframing of how we think about the change. Admixture, the mixing of previously separated populations, is not a footnote to the story of European skin colour. It is a central chapter. The genetic variants that eventually came to dominate didn't just arise or slowly increase within a static European population. They arrived with people, and those people reshaped the European gene pool substantially through demographic replacement and interbreeding. But the reshuffling didn't stop with the Neolithic transition. Several thousand years after the Anatolian farmers began transforming Europe, another massive migration arrived, this time from a very different direction. Beginning roughly 5,000 years ago, during the Bronze Age, large groups of pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching across what is now Ukraine and Russia, began moving westward into Europe in extraordinary numbers. These were the people associated with the Yamnaya culture and related groups, and their genetic impact on Europe was enormous. Ancient DNA studies suggest that steppe ancestry came to represent a substantial fraction, in some regions the majority, of the ancestry of later European populations. Entire communities were transformed or replaced within just a few generations. These steppe migrants carried yet another distinct genetic profile, including their own particular pigmentation variants and their own allele frequencies across the relevant genes. When their DNA poured into a European population already shaped by the mixing of hunter-gatherers and Anatolian farmers, it reshuffled the frequencies again. The result was a further recomposition of the European gene pool, and with it, another round of changes in which pigmentation variants were common, and which were rare. What emerges from all of this is a picture of extraordinary demographic turbulence. Modern Europeans are not the descendants of a single ancestral group that stayed put and slowly evolved. They are the product of at least three major population layers: ancient hunter-gatherers, Anatolian farmers, and steppe pastoralists, whose successive mixing and partial replacement produced the ancestry distributions we see today. And the skin colour associated with contemporary European populations reflects that history directly. It is not the result of one clean episode of adaptation. It is the outcome of multiple migrations carrying multiple variants into a shared space, followed by natural selection continuing to act on that combined, reshuffled pool of genetic variation. This is why the concept of population replacement matters so much to this story. Selection explains why certain variants increased in frequency once they were present, but migration explains how they got there in the first place, and in what quantities. Remove the demographic history, the Anatolian farmers moving northwest, the steppe pastoralists moving west, and the genetic ingredients for modern European pigmentation simply aren't present in the right proportions, or the right places to produce the outcome we observe in the ancient DNA record. The appearance of Europe today is, in a very real sense, a palimpsest. Layers of different people written over one another across thousands of years, each wave contributing something to the genome of the next, until selection sorted the results into what we now recognize as characteristically European. It is a deeply mixed origin story, built from movement as much as mutation, from contact as much as adaptation. So when we talk about 8,000 years ago as a turning point, it's worth being precise about what that actually means, and what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that on some specific morning 8 millennia ago, a single mutation flickered into existence and spread instantly across a population. Evolution doesn't work that way, and the genetics certainly doesn't show that. What 8,000 years ago represents is more like a threshold, a moment in a much longer process when several forces that had been building separately suddenly began operating together in the same places, on the same populations at the same time. The result was an acceleration so pronounced that it shows up clearly in the ancient DNA record as something genuinely different from what came before. To see why, it helps to pull together everything we've covered. For the first 100,000 years or more of our species' history, humans were dark-skinned, and they remained that way even after they left Africa and spread across enormous stretches of the globe. Early Europeans carried dark pigmentation for tens of thousands of years. Neanderthal ancestry mixed into the human lineage without dramatically redirecting the story. The variants that would eventually produce lighter skin were present in some populations at low frequencies, but they weren't spreading rapidly. They weren't sweeping through gene pools. Selection existed, but it wasn't acting with overwhelming force. Or if it was, something was limiting how fast change could accumulate. Then farming arrived, and migration followed, and those two things, layered on top of whatever selective pressure vitamin D synthesis was already providing, changed the pace of everything. Farming mattered because it altered the fundamental relationship between humans and sunlight in ways that accumulated across generations. Settled agricultural populations ate differently from hunter-gatherers, diets that were lower in the oily fish, and organ meats that provided preformed vitamin D regardless of skin pigmentation, and higher in cultivated grains that provided almost none. This dietary shift made endogenous vitamin D synthesis, the kind your skin produces in response to sunlight, more important, not less. At the same time, the clearing of forests for fields opened up more sunlight exposure in some respects, while the rhythms of sedentary farming life also concentrated people indoors or in sheltered settlements during much of the day. The balance of pressures on skin pigmentation shifted, and it shifted in a way that made lighter skin more advantageous among farming populations in lower sunlight environments than it had been among the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. Migration then delivered the genetic raw material to populations that needed it. As we just discussed, the Anatolian farmers moving into Europe carried higher frequencies of the key light skin alleles than the hunter-gatherers already living there. Their expansion wasn't just a cultural diffusion of farming practices, it was a demographic event that physically introduced new genetic variants into the European gene pool at scale. Selection could then act on those variants with greater efficiency precisely because they were now present at higher frequencies and in populations where the pressure favouring them was strong. This is why 8,000 years ago marks a meaningful convergence rather than a single moment. It's the period when farming populations were consolidating and expanding, when migration was actively reshaping the genetic composition of entire continents, and when the selective environment created by a grain-based diet and a low-latitude sky was pressing hardest on pigmentation genetics. All three forces, diet-driven selection pressure, demographic movement carrying new variants, and the ongoing operation of natural selection, were working together. That combination produced an acceleration in the spread of light skin alleles that simply hadn't been seen in the long millennia before. And this points to something important about the Holocene more broadly. The period after the last ice age, the world we're still technically living in, has been an unusually fast-moving chapter in human evolutionary history. Not because the underlying mechanisms of evolution changed, but because the speed of environmental and lifestyle change accelerated dramatically. Agriculture, sedentism, animal domestication, new diets, new diseases, new population densities, new patterns of migration, all of these transformed the selective environment for human populations within time spans that are short by evolutionary standards. When environments change quickly, selection has more to work with and produces faster results. The Holocene has been, in evolutionary terms, a period of unusual turbulence. This is a genuinely important reframing. We tend to imagine human evolution as something that happened long ago, in deep African prehistory, across Ice Age landscapes, among populations that barely resembled us culturally. We think of ourselves as the finished product, looking back at ancestors who are still being shaped. But the evidence doesn't support that picture. The changes we've been discussing in skin pigmentation happened overwhelmingly within the last 10,000 years, and many of them concentrated within the last 6 or 7,000. These are timescales that feel distant to us personally, but are essentially instantaneous in evolutionary terms. And they tell us something simple and profound. Evolution did not stop when civilization started. It sped up. Visible traits like skin color are simply the easiest place to see this, because ancient DNA can recover pigmentation genetics with reasonable precision, and because we have robust independent evidence from comparative anatomy, from vitamin D physiology, from the agricultural and migratory record, to help us understand why certain variants were favoured when and where they were. But the same logic almost certainly applies to other traits where farming, migration, and new selective pressures converged. Lactase persistence, disease resistance, metabolic adaptations to new diets. Evolution was running fast across multiple systems simultaneously, driven by the same Holocene turbulence. When environments and lifestyles change quickly, bodies follow, not overnight and not perfectly. Natural selection is a slow and imprecise process even at its fastest. But over the span of a few thousand years, with strong enough pressure and the right genetic variation to act on, the results can be striking. Skin color in Europe is one of the clearest examples in the human record of recent, rapid, visible evolution driven by identifiable causes, and 8,000 years ago is roughly when the conditions that made that possible all came together at once. Here's the thing though, everything we've traced about Europe, about farming populations and Anatolian migrations and the rapid spread of specific alleles, tells only one version of a story that actually played out multiple times across the globe. If you walk away thinking that lighter skin is a single invention that spread outward from one place and one moment, you'd be carrying a picture that the genetics directly contradicts. Light skin in East Asia and light skin in Europe are not the same thing at the molecular level. They largely arose through different genes, different variants, and different histories. The pigmentation pathways overlap in their end product, reduce melanin production, less darkly pigmented skin. but the specific genetic routes that got there were distinct. Some of the key variants that drove lightening in European populations are found at low frequencies, or are essentially absent in East Asian populations, and vice versa. What this tells us is that when human populations in different parts of the world encountered broadly similar environmental pressures, they solved the same biological problem using whatever genetic variation they had available locally. The solution looked similar from the outside. The mechanism underneath was different. This is convergent evolution, and it's one of the most important and frequently misunderstood concepts in understanding human diversity. Convergent evolution happens when similar environments or selection pressures independently push separate lineages towards similar outcomes. Dolphins and fish both have streamlined bodies for moving through water, but they arrived at that shape through entirely separate evolutionary histories. The shape is the same, the path to it is not. The same logic applies to skin pigmentation across human populations. Europe and East Asia both lie at higher latitudes than the equatorial regions, where our species spent most of its early history. Both regions provided less ultraviolet radiation for large parts of the year. Both posed the same fundamental challenge to vitamin D synthesis that dark skin created in low-light conditions. Selection in both regions favoured reduced pigmentation, but the specific genetic changes that answered that pressure were, to a significant degree, independently derived. This has real implications for how we think about pale skin as a category. It is not a single unified trait with a single unified history. People of European ancestry and people of East Asian ancestry may look similarly light-skinned to a casual observer, but they got there through different molecular journeys, over different timescales, shaped by different demographic histories. Assuming that all pale-skinned populations share the same pigmentation story is a bit like assuming that all mammals that swim must be closely related fish. The surface resemblance is real. The underlying history is not the same, but convergent evolution also has limits, and nowhere is that clearer than when you look at Arctic and subarctic populations. Here the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because it breaks the simple rule that latitude predicts pigmentation. Indigenous Arctic populations, groups that have lived at extremely high latitudes, with dramatic seasonal variation in sunlight and long winters of near total UV darkness, tend to have relatively darker skin than you might expect given where they live. And the reason why brings us back to something that came up when we discussed farming: diet. The populations that settled the Arctic and subarctic regions were, for most of their history, extraordinary hunters of fatty marine animals, seals, walruses, whales, fish rich in oil. These foods are among the densest natural sources of preformed vitamin D on the planet. When you consume enough fatty marine life, your body can maintain adequate vitamin D levels even through winters of almost no sunlight, and even with a level of skin pigmentation that would be deeply disadvantageous for a farmer eating grain in northern Europe, the dietary supply of vitamin D effectively substituted for the cutaneous synthesis that lighter skin would have enabled. The selection pressure that drove to pigmentation in farming populations simply didn't operate with the same force in populations that were getting their vitamin D from a bowl rather than the sky. This is a profound example of how ecology shapes evolution in ways that defy simple geographic rules. Latitude alone cannot predict skin color. What matters is the full ecological and dietary context in which a population has lived. A group farming grain at 50 degrees north latitude faced a fundamentally different selection environment than a group hunting seals at the same latitude or higher. The sky above them might provide similar amounts of ultraviolet light, but the relationship between that light and their survival was different, because one population depended on synthesizing vitamin D from sunlight while the other was eating it in large quantities. Evolution responds to the actual selective environment organisms live in, not the simplified version of that environment we draw on a map. This is why any model that tries to predict human pigmentation from latitude alone will fail to account for real-world variation. Diet, ecology, the specifics of which foods were available, which subsistence strategies populations used, which genetic variants happen to be present in a founding population, all of these interact with latitude to produce the actual pigmentation outcomes we observe. The global pattern of human skin colour is not a clean gradient from dark at the equator to pale at the poles. It's a more complex mosaic shaped by multiple independent evolutionary events, dietary histories, migration paths, and ecological contexts that varied enormously from one region to another. What this broader view makes unmistakably clear is that the story of light skin is not a story about a single human transformation with a single cause. It's a story about separate populations in separate places, finding separate genetic paths toward broadly similar outcomes under broadly similar pressures, but with enough variation in the details that the outcomes themselves differ in their molecular architecture, their timing, and their ecological logic. Europe's story is real and well documented and striking in its speed, but it is one story among several, and placing it in that larger context changes what it means. So we've established that skin colour evolved multiple times through different genes on different timescales in response to specific ecological pressures that varied from one part of the world to another. What does that actually mean for the way we think about human difference? Because this isn't just an academic question about melanin and ultraviolet radiation. The story of pigmentation runs directly into one of the most charged and consequential ideas in human histories, the idea of race. Let's start with what the science most clearly shows. Skin colour is a recent trait, not recent in terms of months or decades, but recent in the deep timescale of our species. For the vast majority of the 100,000 years and more that anatomically modern humans have existed, the baseline was dark. The widespread depigmentation we see today in populations across Europe, parts of East Asia and elsewhere, is largely a product of the last 10 to 15,000 years, with some of the most significant changes happening even more recently than that. We're talking about a trait that, in evolutionary terms, is almost brand new. And it is, in the most precise biological sense, shallow, a surface-level adaptation to a specific environmental variable, achieved through changes in a relatively small number of genes out of the roughly 20,000 that make up the human genome. That shallowness matters enormously when people encounter visible differences between human populations, in skin tone, in hair texture, in facial features. There's a deeply human tendency to assume that those visible differences reflect deeper, more pervasive biological divisions. If people look that different on the outside, the intuition goes, surely they must be fundamentally different on the inside in all kinds of ways. But that intuition is wrong, and the genetics of pigmentation is one of the clearest demonstrations of why. Visible traits like skin colour are precisely the traits that have been under the strongest recent selection pressure. They're the traits where populations have diverged most visibly because the environment demanded it. But they're not representative of the genome as a whole. The vast majority of human genetic variation doesn't map onto the visible categories we use to divide people. When geneticists look at genetic variation across the entire human genome, not just the handful of pigmentation genes, but the whole thing, they find that most variation exists within populations rather than between them. Two people from the same broad population group can differ genetically from each other, more than either of them differs from someone in a population that looks quite different on the surface. The visible signal is loud. The underlying genetic signal is far more complicated and far less categorical. There's also a deeper geographic reality here. Human genetic variation doesn't come in discrete packets that correspond to continental groups. It comes in gradients. As you move across the globe, allele frequencies shift gradually, with neighbouring populations sharing more in common than distant ones, and the boundaries between groups blurring rather than snapping into clean divisions. The categories we call races are imposed on top of this continuous variation. They are social tools for organising human difference, and they have real social consequences that are absolutely worth taking seriously. But they do not describe discrete biological divisions that exist independently of the human minds doing the categorizing. Where you draw the lines is a cultural and historical choice, not a biological discovery. The history of pigmentation illustrates this perfectly. If you trace the ancestry of any given light-skinned European today, you find a complex mixture of populations: early European hunter-gatherers, Anatolian farmers, steppe pastoralists, each of whom contributed different variants to the genetic mosaic we observe today. The people who carry these traits don't descend from a single ancestral group with a single ancestral set of characteristics. They descend from multiple migrations, multiple admixtures, multiple episodes of selection, acting on different traits at different times. What looks like a coherent category from the outside, European or pale or whatever label gets applied, dissolves on closer inspection into a layered and continuously shifting ancestry that defies any essentialist reading. Essentialism is the idea that human groups have fixed, deep, intrinsic natures that determine who they are. It's the idea that the visible surface reflects something real and stable underneath. The genetics of skin colour directly challenges that view, a trait that was largely absent 8,000 years ago in populations where it's now common cannot be a timeless essence. A trait that evolved independently along different genetic pathways in different populations cannot be a marker of shared deep biology between all the people who happen to carry it. And a trait that changed so rapidly, in centuries or a few thousand years rather than hundreds of thousands, is not a fixed property of any group. It is a recent response to a changing world. None of this erases the reality of human diversity. People do differ across populations in medically relevant ways, in the frequency of certain genetic variants, in adaptations to specific environments. Those differences are real and worth understanding carefully. But they are not organised the way folk categories of race suggest. They don't cluster into the neat continental divisions that social history has imposed. They reflect a species that spread across the entire planet, adapted to vastly different environments, mixed and separated and mixed again, an accumulated variation that is distributed in complex, overlapping, gradient-like patterns that resist the clean divisions we've tried to draw. Skin colour is the most visible chapter of that story, and it's been given an enormous amount of cultural and social weight. But biologically, it's a thin chapter: a few genes, a recent change, a surface response to sunlight. Beneath that surface, the deeper story of what humans share and how we vary is far richer, far less categorical, and far more interesting than any simple division by appearance could ever capture. Here's the thing that's easy to lose sight of after all this detail about genes and migrations and selection pressures. Step back far enough, and the picture becomes almost startling in its simplicity. For most of the time our species has existed, essentially all humans were dark-skinned. That wasn't a regional trait or a local adaptation. It was the human condition. The variation we see today, the full spectrum of skin tones distributed across every continent, is largely the product of the last sliver of our evolutionary history. If you compress the entire existence of anatomically modern humans into a single year, the widespread emergence of light skin would appear sometime in the final week or two of December. What drove that change wasn't one thing, but a convergence of forces. Ultraviolet radiation set the baseline, darker skin protecting folate and shielding DNA under intense equatorial sun, while lower UV environments opened the door for depigmentation in populations that moved north. but UV alone doesn't explain the timing. Humans had been living at higher latitudes for tens of thousands of years before light skin became common across those regions. What accelerated the shift was a transformation in how people lived. Farming replaced diets rich in vitamin D. Dense agricultural populations with less time outdoors faced a genuine deficiency crisis, one that made even small gains in cutaneous vitamin D synthesis matter enormously for survival and reproduction. Selection that might have taken far longer under hunter-gatherer conditions suddenly had urgent work to do. Then came migration. The people who carried the alleles associated with lighter skin weren't simply the descendants of the first humans to arrive in Europe. They were newcomers, arriving in waves from Anatolia and the Eurasian steppe, mixing with populations already present, and shifting the genetic landscape of entire continents within a few thousand years. The skin colour patterns we observe today are not the inherited properties of ancient stable populations. They are the outcomes of movement, mixture, and selection, all operating at once, in the same centuries on the same people. What this adds up to is something that should genuinely reframe how we think about human appearance. The categories that have been treated throughout much of history as fixed, natural, and ancient are none of those things. They are recent, they are contingent. They emerge from specific ecological and historical pressures that could have played out differently, and in some cases did play out differently, producing similar outcomes through entirely distinct genetic roots in populations that never shared a common ancestor anywhere close to the relevant time frame. And the process hasn't stopped. Humans are not a finished product. We are a species still responding to changing environments, still carrying the marks of migrations our ancestors completed thousands of years ago, still accumulating the variation that future generations will inherit in a world we can't fully predict. What happened 8,000 years ago was not an ending. It was just the most recent chapter in a story that started long before any of us and continues still.